Welcome dear participants, welcome to the SWAYAM course. This is week 4 lecture number 3, module is respiratory system, and today's lecture is regulation of respiration and the type of hypoxia. So myself Dr. Mukesh Kumar Bharti, I am assistant professor in the Department of Veterinary Physiology and Biochemistry, Banaras Hindu University. So we'll see what are the things we'll see in this chapter. So in this chapter we'll see what are the how the regulation of respiration is taking place. In the previous class we have discussed about the means how the transport of gases is taking place, means transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then we have seen the how means exchange is taking place and how we can determine the respiratory quiescent. In this class we will see how now the regulation is taking place, how respiration is getting regulated, what are the mechanism are there through which respiration is getting regulated. So in this we see nervous regulation, then we will see the chemical regulation of respiration, we will see how the respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis is developing. Then special one effect is there, that is called as a braking effect, that we will discuss in brief what is called as a braking effect. Then we will see what are the effect of exercise on the respiration, and then finally we will see what is called as a hypoxia, what are the type of hypoxia, and in brief we will discuss what are the anatomical difference is there, and means how the respiration is taking place in the birds, that is the avian respiration, that we will not discuss in detail, but in brief we will give the how what are the major difference from the mammals to the birds is there. So these things we will discuss in today's topic. So now when we say the regulation of respiration, means how the respiration is regulated and why the respiration should be regulated. Respiration is regulated to maintain the concentration of hydrogen ion, carbon dioxide and the oxygen at a relatively constant level. So if any change is there either in the hydrogen ion concentration, carbon dioxide concentration or oxygen concentration, then the respiratory centers are there in the brain which activated. Which we activated means why they will activate? To rectify this problem. So if any kind of change is taking place either in these three things, then the respiratory center will activate to rectify the changes. So that is the main misconcept behind the how the regulation is taking place. So sometimes what is happening, sometimes carbon dioxide concentration or the hydrogen ion concentration is increasing in the blood. So what will happen if the carbon dioxide concentration will increase in the blood? Naturally, to reduce the effect of that carbon dioxide, the ventilation rate will increase. So that will causes the hyperventilation, and once the hyperventilation will takes place, then the whatever the accumulated carbon dioxide is there, that will get removed. Likewise, if oxygen concentration is less in the blood, then also increased respiration is required. Why increased respiration is required? Because oxygen concentration is less in the blood. So to replenish that oxygen amount, the hyperventilation is required to get more amount of oxygen. So that is the concept behind how regulation of respiration is taking place. So this regulation is mainly taking place by two important regulatory mechanism is there. One is called as a nervous or the neural mechanism, and second is called as a chemical mechanism. Nervous or neural mechanism is that directly the nervous different respiratory centers are there that involve in the inspiration and expiration, and second is that the chemical changes means the partial pressure of the either carbon dioxide, oxygen or the hydrogen ion. If that changes is there in this, that will also sensed by the chemical regulators are there, that is called as the chemoreceptors, and through which the changes has been taking place. So basically two important regulators are there, one is called as a nervous or the neural mechanism, and second is called as a chemical mechanism. So first we will discuss about the nervous mechanism or nervous regulation of the respiration. So this nervous regulation is mainly occurs through the respiratory centers. So respiratory centers are basically present in the brain stems that regulates the rhythmic pattern of the breathing and the adjustment of the respiration. So it will mainly regulate the regular pattern of the respiration. Respiratory centers are basically present in the brain stems, and it is not a collection of defined nuclei. These respiratory centers are not a collection of defined nuclei, rather it consists of a region within the medulla oblongata and pons having specific respiration related functions. So this is a defined region, defined collection in the medulla oblongata and the pons of the brain, where they have the specific respiration related functions. So basically 4 specific regions are present in the medulla oblongata and the pons, that is called as a respiratory centers. So which are the centers are there? One is that is called as a first is called as a DRG. DRG means dorsal respiratory group. Second is called as a VRG, ventral respiratory group. Third, the pneumotaxic center, and fourth is the apneustic center. So this first, if you talk about the DRG, DRG is situated in the nucleus of tractus solitarius, which is present in the dorsal portion of the medulla oblongata. So this dorsal respiratory group is mainly present in the dorsal part of the medulla oblongata. Then ventral respiratory group, it is present in the nucleus ambiguous and nucleus retroambiguous, which is situated in the ventral portion of the medulla. So in the dorsal portion, the dorsal respiratory group is present, and in the ventral portion of medulla, the ventral respiratory group is present. Then third is called as the pneumotaxic center, which is present in the upper part of the pons, and fourth is the apneustic center, which is present in the lower pons. So these are the defined region is there in the both in the medulla oblongata and in the pons. So first we will discuss about the how the dorsal respiratory group, what is the function of dorsal respiratory group, for which function it mainly perform. So this dorsal respiratory group mainly associated with the inspiratory activity. So whatever the inspiratory activity is there, mainly control center is the dorsal respiratory group. Also it have a important role in the generation of basic rhythm of respiration. So basic rhythm of respiration as well as inspiratory activity is performed by the dorsal respiratory group. So generally this dorsal respiratory group send its output signal to the phrenic nerve, and this phrenic nerve is generally present in the diaphragm, and we know that diaphragm is called as a chief inspiratory muscles. So which lead to the contraction of the diaphragm followed by the inspiratory phase of the breathing cycle. So once it will send the information to the phrenic nerve, then diaphragm will contract, and as the diaphragm will contract, that will lead to the inspiration activity will start. Then this input signal of the DRG comes to the vagal and the glossopharyngeal nerve. Once the inspiration will start, then the mechanoreceptors which are present in the alveoli, that will be get stimulated, and once this will get stimulated, it will send the information to the DRG via the vagus nerve, and then the termination of inspiration will takes place. And once the termination of inspiration will takes place, then the initiation of expiration will takes place. So mainly dorsal respiratory group is responsible for the inspiratory activity. Here in the means graphical diagrammatic representation is there, that how DRG will send the information to the phrenic nerve, then the diaphragm will contract, and then the inspiration will occurs, and once the inspiration will occurs, it will stimulate the mechanoreceptors in the alveoli, and then the impulse will go through the vagus and the glossopharyngeal nerves, and that will lead to the termination of the inspiration. Second is the called as a ventral respiratory group, VRG. VRG is mainly responsible for the both inspiration as well as the expiratory activity, but primarily its function is responsible for the expiration. Although it have both kind of function, inspiration as well as expiration, but primarily it meant for the expiration. So expiratory phase of respiration is mainly controlled by the ventral respiratory group. The neurons of the ventral respiratory group remain almost totally inactive during normal quiet respiration. So normal quiet respiration, at that time their neurons will remain totally inactive. Now what will happen? The electrical stimulation of few neurons in the ventral group causes the inspiration, whereas the stimulation of other causes the expirations. So I told that they have meant for the both kind of inspiration as well as the expiration. So whatever the kind of stimulation will be there, that type of activity will be performed. Therefore these neurons contribute to the both inspiration as well as the expirations. This ventral expiratory group is especially important for providing the forceful expiratory signal to the abdominal muscles during the heavy expiration. So when we perform the heavy expiration, at that time the impulse will send to the ventral respiratory group. So VRG is responsible for both inspiration as well as expiration, but mainly it is responsible for the expiration. Then third is called as a pneumotaxic center. The pneumotaxic center will regulate the depth and the rate of respiration. The depth and the rate of respiration is controlled by the pneumotaxic center. The primary function of the pneumotaxic center is to limit the inspiration. Its main function is to limit the inspiration, also called as a switch off point of the inspiration. So to stop the inspiration, the pneumotaxic center should be activated. Hence, the controlling the degree of filling phase of the respiratory cycle. So how much inspiration will be takes place, that will be controlled by the pneumotaxic center. If pneumotaxic center will be deactivated, the filling phase will be stopped. The pneumotaxic center controls the filling phase by maybe by the strong or weak signal. So both kind of signal will be received. If the signal will be strong or weak, then that will define how much inspiration will be takes place. So when the pneumotaxic signal is strong, the inspiration might last for as little as 0.5 second, and thus the filling of the lung will be only slightly. So if the strong signal will come, switch off point will be activated easily. So once the switch off point will be activated easily, the inspiration will stop, and then the filling phase will remain for the very shorter duration of time. When the pneumotaxic signal is weak, the inspiration may last continue for the 5 or more second, and the filling of the lungs will take place with the great excess of air. It means that when the pneumotaxic signal is weak, at that time the signal for stopping the inspiration will not take place, and in that case the inspiration phase will means prolong for longer duration of time. Fourth is called as a apneustic center. So this is very least developed center. The not much study has been done for study of this center, apneustic center, but it is believed to be associated with the deep inspiration. So deep inspiration, also called as a apneuresis. So deep inspiration is mainly associated with this apneustic center. So this apneustic center sends the signal to the dorsal group in the medulla to delay the inspiratory switch off signal and provided by the apneustic center. So if this system will be remain inactive, the more kind of inspiration will takes place. So perhaps the complementary breaths that we are doing the sigh kind of breathing, which is a manifestation of this apneustic center. So complementary breathing, which is not the characteristics, that is the characteristics of deep inspiration, that is mainly controlled by this apneustic center. So these are the four important respiratory center in the brain that controls the different phase of the respiration. Now very important one reflex is there, that is called as a Herring-Brewer reflex. So Herring-Brewer reflex is mainly basically is a protective reflex that restrict the inspiration and prevent the overstretching of lung tissue. So if this kind of stretch receptor will not present in the lungs may be stretched out, overstretching may take place, but due to presence of this kind of reflex, overstretching of lungs is getting prevented, because in this case the receptors are present in the bronchi and the bronchioles, wall of the bronchi and the bronchioles, and once the more amount of air is coming into the alveoli, these receptors are getting activated, because these are the stretch receptor. So once the air is coming into the alveoli, due to the pressure the stretching is taking place, and due to that these receptors are getting stimulated, and then this receptor sends the information to the dorsal group of neuron via the vagal afferent fiber, and inhibit them. So, the inspiration will be stop and the expiration will be start. So, in this way this receptor is very helpful in preventing the overstretching of the lung tissue. So, that is called as a Herring-Brewer reflex. So, there are other peripheral receptors are there that will stimulate the respiration. So, not only the receptors which are located in the lungs, there are other peripherally located receptors that assist in the respiration. So, what are the receptors are there that assist in respiration? One of the receptors we will discuss here, that receptors present in the skin which is excitatory to the respiratory center. So, this is what is the advantage of that kind of receptor? This is advantageous when the respiration stimulation of the breathing is desired in the newborn animals. So, one example is that rubbing of the skin with the rough cloth often start the breathing cycle. So, once the animal will born, if the respiration is not stimulated properly, so what we have to do, we need to rub the skin of the newborn calf. That rubbing will stimulate the respiration. How it will stimulate? The receptors which are present in the skin that are excitatory in nature, they will send the information to the brain centers to activate the respiration. So, that in this way this type of receptors are very helpful. During muscular activity, receptors located in the tendons and the joints will assist in the ventilation. They will be stimulate the respiration, because when we do some kind of exercise, due to the metabolic activity carbon dioxide is produced, and if more carbon dioxide is accumulated, then they will activate the excited expiratory center to do the more kind of respiration. So, in this way the joints and the tendons, receptors which are present in the joints and tendons, they will also assist in the ventilation. So, that is the nervous control of respiration. Now, we will discuss how the chemical control of respiration is taking place. The chemical control of respiration is operated through this receptor that is called as a chemoreceptors. These chemoreceptors are sensory nerve endings which give response to the change in the chemical constituent of the blood. Chemical constituents of blood here mainly is the partial pressure of the changes in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, change in the partial pressure of oxygen, or change in the hydrogen ion concentration. So, if any change in these three things is taking place, that will activate the chemoreceptors, and then these chemoreceptors will regulate the respiration. Either inspiration will take place or expiration, and mostly these chemoreceptors are excitatory in nature. So, what are the factors is there which will stimulate the chemoreceptors? So, there are three important factors there. One is the decreased partial pressure of oxygen. If there is a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, mainly is taking place at the time of hypoxia. Then another is if there will be the increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, that is called as a hypercapnia. Increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Capnia means carbon dioxide. And third is that if there is an increased hydrogen ion concentration, if acidity is developing, that will also stimulate the chemoreceptors. So, if there is a decreased partial pressure of oxygen, if there is increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide, or if there is a increased hydrogen ion concentration. So, these things will stimulate the chemoreceptors. So, these chemoreceptors are generally classified into two groups. Two types of chemoreceptors are there. One is called as a central chemoreceptor, another is called as a peripheral chemoreceptors. So, central chemoreceptors and peripheral chemoreceptors. So, one by one we will see how these chemoreceptors help in the controlling the respirations. The central chemoreceptors are the chemoreceptors which is present in the brain. That is why name has been given the central. And peripheral means the receptors which are present outside the brain. So, central chemoreceptors are present in the brain, situated in the deeper part of the medulla oblongata and close to the dorsal respiratory group of the neurons. And this area is known as a chemosensitive area, and the neurons are called as a chemoreceptor. So, chemoreceptors, why name has been given? Because the receptors which is sensitive to the chemical changes, that which the receptor which sense the chemical change, that is why name has been given the chemoreceptors. So these chemoreceptors are in close contact with the blood and the CSF and are excitatory to the respiratory center, causing the increase in the tidal volume and the frequency. They will increase the tidal volume as well as the frequency, and these chemoreceptors are normally very close contact with the blood and the CSF. Why they are in close contact? If they will not in close contact, they will not sense the changes which is taking place in the blood and the CSFs. So that's why these chemoreceptors are generally remain in close contact with the blood and the CSF, so that whatever the, if any kind of changes is taking place in the blood constituents, that will be easily sensed by these chemoreceptors. These chemoreceptors are connected with the respiratory centers through the synapses. So its action is slowly, but it's very effective. So its action is perhaps very slow, but it will act very effectively. The main stimulant for the central chemoreceptors is the increased hydrogen ion concentration. Now the question is that how these chemoreceptors are getting activated. So for the central chemoreceptor, main stimulant is the increased hydrogen ion concentration. But here one important concept is that this increased hydrogen concentration, the hydrogen ion is not permeable to the blood-brain barrier. So hydrogen ion cannot pass this blood-brain barrier directly. So how then it will stimulate the central chemoreceptors? It will do indirectly. How it will do indirectly? It will do through the production of CO2. This CO2 is permeable to the blood-brain barrier. So this CO2 will enter into the blood, they will enter through the blood-brain barrier, and then they will do the reaction with the water, and the formation of carbonic acid will take place, and this carbonic acid will break into the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion, and then this hydrogen ion will lead to the stimulation of the central chemoreceptor. So directly they are not stimulating the central chemoreceptor, but indirectly they are stimulating the central chemoreceptor by through the carbon dioxide. So main stimulant for the central chemoreceptor is the hydrogen ion concentration. This hydrogen ion concentration will stimulate the chemoreceptor, and from this chemoreceptor the excitatory impulse will send to the dorsal respiratory group of the neurons, and then that will result in the increased ventilation. Because of this, excess carbon dioxide will be washed out and the respiration will back to the normal. So in this way the respiration will bring back to the normal. So that is the central chemoreceptor. Now the peripheral chemoreceptor. The peripheral chemoreceptors are the chemoreceptors which are not present in the brain, they are present outside the brain. They are present in mainly in the carotid and the aortic region. So these chemoreceptors are present in the carotid and the aortic region. So the carotid body, the sensory fibers are the glossopharyngeal nerves, and for the aortic body the sensory fiber are the vagus nerves. So these peripheral chemoreceptors are sensitive to change in the partial pressure of oxygen, change in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and also the change in the hydrogen ion concentration. So what will happen if there is a drastic decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, or there is an increase in the partial pressure of carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion concentration, they will stimulate the inspiratory area to increase the rate and depth of the breathing. So if there is a decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen, or if there is increase in partial pressure of carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion, they will stimulate the inspiratory center, and then they will increase the depth of breathing. These chemoreceptors will respond to the partial pressure of oxygen in the plasma and not the amount of oxygen. These peripheral chemoreceptors is only activated through the partial pressure of oxygen, not the amount of oxygen which is present in the plasma. That is why there is no change in the respiration rate takes place in the anemia. In the anemia also there is a concentration of the oxygen is changing, not the partial pressure is changing. That is why there is no change in respiration in case of the ammonia. So for the peripheral chemoreceptor, most potent stimulant is the hypoxia. We have seen for the central chemoreceptor, most potent stimulant was the hydrogen ion, but for this peripheral chemoreceptor, the most potent stimulant is the hypoxia. So what is happening here? The impulse is generated in the glomus cell. Very important cells are there, that is called as a glomus cells, and impulse is generating here. Why impulse is generating here? Because this glomus cells have the potassium and the sodium channel. So that's why the impulse is generating in the glomus cells, and then through this the impulse are passed through the aortic and the herring nerve, and they will excite the dorsal group of neurons, and then this dorsal group of neurons send the excitatory impulse to the respiratory center, and that result in the increased ventilation, and this will provide the enough oxygen, and once the enough oxygen will be provided, that will rectify the lack of the oxygen. So whatever the hypoxia is developing, that will be rectified by increasing the ventilations. Now, what is called as a respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis? So respiratory acidosis means when the accumulation of carbon dioxide will take place in the blood, that will lead to the respiratory acidosis, and this respiratory acidosis develop during the hypoventilation, means when the respiration rate are getting reduced, at that time the carbon dioxide will accumulate in the blood, and that will lead to the respiratory acidosis. In reverse to that, another term is there, that is called a respiratory alkalosis. So respiratory alkalosis develop during the hyperventilation. So during the hyperventilation, more amount of carbon dioxide will be passed out from the body, so that lead to the development of a alkalosis. So hyperventilation lead to the respiratory alkalosis, whereas the hypoventilation lead to the respiratory acidosis. So based on that, very important effect is there, that is called as a braking effect. Braking effect means some kind of brake must be applied. So what will happen if the accumulation of carbon dioxide or hydrogen ion will takes place, then what will happen to rectify this, the hyperventilation will take place, means respiration rate will increase, but some kind of brake should be applied to prevent the excessive loss of carbon dioxide from the body and to develop the alkalosis. So this brake is provided by important one, that there will be the decrease in the ventilation due to decrease in the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen ion concentration. So important mechanism is there, that even the carbon dioxide concentration are decreasing, at that time the ventilation are decreasing to not to develop the respiratory alkalosis. The effect, the braking effect is defined as the effect by which the reduced concentration of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion decrease the alveolar ventilation, that is known as a braking effect. So what is the significance of this braking effect? The benefit of braking effect is that it prevents the respiratory alkalosis. It prevents the development of respiratory alkalosis that might occur during the ascent to the high altitude with reduced oxygen. So at high altitude, due to the reduced oxygen, hyperventilation is taking place, and side by side the carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration are also getting decreasing. But at the some point of time, this decreased carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion concentration will decrease the ventilation also, so that furthermore hyperventilation should not take place, and it should not decrease the means concentration of carbon dioxide, and there should not be development of the respiratory alkalosis. Now, what are the effect of exercise on the respiration? As we all know, when we do some kind of exercise, the respiration rate are getting increased too much. So in this case, the metabolism also taking place in the body, so carbon dioxide are also getting accumulated, and this carbon dioxide once it getting accumulated, they will stimulate the respiratory center to do the hyperventilation. So because of the activation of the joint and the muscle, then the production of more carbon dioxide taking place, and this carbon dioxide will stimulate the respiration. Now what is happening, another thing is that cardiac output are getting increased during the exercise, that result in the increased pulmonary blood flow, and this pulmonary blood flow, if that much amount of blood going to the lung, that will causes the more uniform flow of the blood to the lungs. So important one more effect is there, that effect of exercise on the oxygen depth. As we know that during the exercise more amount of oxygen is required. So oxygen depth is taking place, means extra amount of oxygen is required to do the exercise. During when we are doing severe exercise, at that time extra amount of oxygen is required, and that is getting built up, and this is called as a oxygen depth. So oxygen depth is around 6 times more than that of the amount of oxygen consumed under the normal resting condition. So when we are doing some kind of a physical exercise, at that time this oxygen depth is increased to around 6-fold compared to that of the what we are doing in the normal conditions. Now hypoxia is there. There are different types of hypoxia. It means there is the reduced availability of oxygen to the tissue. So if there is the decreased partial pressure of oxygen to the tissue, that is called as a hypoxia. There are 4 important factors are there that lead to the development of hypoxia. One is called as a, if there will be the oxygen partial pressure of blood will be less, or if there will be the oxygen carrying capacity of blood will be less. If the velocity of blood flow will be less, then also development of hypoxia will take place. And if the oxygen will not utilized by the tissue, then also the development of hypoxia will takes place. So based on the above factors, there are 4 types of hypoxia there. One is called as a hypoxic hypoxia, second is anemic hypoxia, third is a stagnant hypoxia, and fourth is called as a histotoxic hypoxia. So all type of hypoxia may be acute or the chronic. So first is the hypoxic hypoxia. It means ki if there is a decreased oxygen partial pressure in the blood. So what can be the causes for this hypoxic hypoxia? If there is a low oxygen partial pressure in the inspired air, if there any kind of respiratory disorders are there, like obstruction in the respiratory passage, or if there is any kind of cardiac disorders, like if congestive heart failure is there, that time also that kind of hypoxia may develop. Second is that anemic type of hypoxia. It means any factor that will lead to the development of anemia will causes the anemic hypoxia. It means if there will be the decreased number of RBC, decreased number of hemoglobin, or if the hemoglobin will be altered, then also the development of anemic hypoxia will take place. Third is the stagnant hypoxia. It means if the velocity of blood flow is not proper, then the stagnant type of hypoxia will develop. The following reason are there, means if there is congestive heart failure, if there is any kind of hemorrhage, surgical shock, if any kind of thrombosis is there, or if any kind of constriction is there. In all these cases, the velocity of blood flow will be less, and that will lead to the development of stagnant hypoxia. Histotopic hypoxia means the amount of oxygen will be available to the tissue, but tissue will be tissue have the inability to utilize that oxygen. This type of condition occurring during the cyanide or sulfide poisoning. So during the poisoning cases, sufficient amount of oxygen available to the tissue, but tissue are unable to utilize that amount of oxygen. So that is called as a histotoxic hypoxia. So based on hypoxia, one important disease is there, that is called as a brisket disease. So this is a common in the cattle that raised at a high altitude, that is characterized by the accumulation of edematous fluid in the brisket region, and that developed due to the failure of the right sided heart. So right side of the heart failure it takes place, and then that lead to the accumulation of fluid in the brisket region, and that's why name has been given the brisket disease. So that is the how the regulation of respiration is taking place. In that we have discussed central regulation as well as the chemical regulation. So how the respiration is mammalian respiration is different from the avian respiration. What are the important peculiarities there in the birds that differentiate them from the mammals? So in case of the birds have a small lungs, and that too have a rigid lungs, they cannot expand and contract. They have the air sacs that is not present in case of the mammals, and these air sacs assist in the ventilation of the birds. The birds have the syrinx in place of the larynx that is present in the mammals. The birds have the complete tracheal ring, which is incomplete in case of the mammals, and in case of the birds they have a relatively larger tidal volume in compared to the mammals, and also they have a relatively lower respiratory frequency compared to that of a mammals. And most important thing is that birds do not have a diaphragm, and that is very peculiar feature of the mammals. So these are the some of the features which are especially present in the birds, and birds respiration is very different from that of the mammals. So in this way we have completed the respiratory physiology for the mammals, and in the brief just I have given idea about the birds. Thank you.